Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the webinar series of the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. I'm just finding my text here. Pardon me for 1 second. The center is based at the University of Colorado Boulder. I'm Imtiaz Rangwala, climate science lead at the North Central CASC, co-hosting this webinar with my colleague Heather Yoakum, who is our stakeholder engagement lead. We bring you these webinars to facilitate a discussion of science, research, and best practices related to adaptation and resource management under a rapidly changing climate, with a focus on the north central US that encompasses the Missouri and the upper Colorado River basins. Before I introduce our speaker, a quick word on housekeeping. This will be our last webinar of the spring session. We will take a break over the summer and plan to resume the webinar series in September. We are also recording this webinar, and you can find all our webinar recordings on our website, and we'll put a link for that shortly. During the webinar, all participants will be muted, but you will have the ability to unmute during the Q&A period at the end. We, however, encourage you to put your questions and comments in the chat box anytime during the webinar. And we will start with those questions first during the Q&A in the order they are received. And now it is my real pleasure to introduce Dr. Anna Davidson, our speaker for today. Anna is a research scientist at the Colorado Natural Heritage Program at Colorado State University in Fort Collins, and also a joint faculty member in the Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology at CSU. Her research centers on biodiversity conservation, spanning multiple scales from local field-based ecology to landscape ecology and global-scale macroecology. Much of her work focuses on species that play large and important ecological roles, such as burrowing mammals and large herbivores that shape and transform ecosystems and are central to the conservation of associated species. Anna has a PhD in biology from the University of New Mexico. Her talk today is titled Identifying Potential Landscapes for Conservation Across the Central Grasslands of North America, Integrating Keystone Species, Land Use, and Climate Change. And with that, Anna, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Imtiaz, and thank you both Heather and Imtiaz for inviting me to talk about our project we've been working on. As Imtiaz mentioned, our goal here is to identify priority landscapes for grassland conservation with a focus on the Blacktail prairie dog ecosystem. And if I can toggle forward, there we go. The goal of this project is to identify these landscapes associated with blacktail prairie dogs, because restoring and maintaining blacktail prairie dogs often lies at the core of grassland conservation because of their fundamentally important keystone role that they play. Most of you probably know, but some of you may not be as familiar with prairie dogs. But they provide unique habitats both below and above ground. They create these open grassland landscapes and construct deep, extensive burrow systems, creating three-dimensional habitat structure, which is unavailable in grassland landscapes largely, which provide important homes and shelter for all kinds of animals. And then, of course, they provide important prey for numerous predators, including the black-footed ferret. Many of you may know that the black-footed ferret is North America's most endangered mammal, largely because of the decline of prairie dogs, their primary prey resource. So it's of key importance to restore and maintain these prairie dog colony habitats that support so many other species in these central grassland ecosystems. As I mentioned, they create unique habitats, and you can think of it like a sea of grass, and these colonies that they create are these open islands of unique grassland habitat. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Black-footed Ferret Recovery Plan specifically states, quote, "We believe the single most feasible action that would benefit black-footed ferret recovery is to improve prairie dog conservation. If efforts were undertaken to more proactively manage existing prairie dog habitat for ferret recovery, all other threats to the species would be substantially less difficult to address." So this is why, this underscores our primary motivation for focusing on the black-tailed prairie dog ecosystem as a central part of identifying core areas for grassland conservation throughout central North America. Our goal here is to identify these landscapes by providing map products that consist of various model scenarios. I'll walk you through all of this. And to incorporate this as a collaborative process with wildlife and land managers. It is really integral to the process to have the community of land and wildlife managers helping to vet our work and to inform what products are of greatest value to them so that we can be able to provide a useful resource to help to support their decision-making on the ground. So I'm going to just walk you briefly through our overall methods. The first part of our methods involve identifying that ecological landscape that prairie dogs are most associated with. So developing a habitat suitability model, which you might be familiar with as a species distribution model. Again, focused on the black-tailed prairie dog, but of course it incorporates the species that associate with them by default. So our first effort was to develop a habitat suitability model for the black-tailed prairie dog, and then generate different scenarios based on current and future climate. So looking at what is the habitat suitability for them like now, and what does it look like across their range in the future? And then it's, as so many of you no doubt know, it's not as simple as to identify where ecologically prairie dogs should be or could be, but also to understand other landscape variables, including the social landscape, the political landscape, and other in the threat landscape. So the final part of our project was to incorporate a conservation planning effort, which allows us to look at not only the ecological layers of interest, but also how the connectivity across the landscape, the social landscape, threats, projected climate, land use change, and so on. So I'll walk you through this, but this is the nutshell of what we'll be talking about and of our project. So for the first part, the habitat suitability model was created based on identifying the prairie dog colonies that there's a database called, which we refer to as the West Data, which was a systematic survey that identified prairie dog occurrences across the black-tailed prairie dog range within the US. So we use that data in combination with other ecological layers such as land cover, soils, topography, and climate. And that was a central, these are the basic layers that were included in our analysis to identify the most suitable habitats for prairie dogs. This is that West Data I was referring to. You can see on the left there represents the study area where the researchers used NAPE imagery to identify prairie dog occurrences across the black-tailed prairie dog geographic range. It's a systematic survey, so not all cells were sampled, but there was a random sample done. So this is it provided us with both presence and absence data and a really nice systematic sample of prairie dog occurrences from about 2014. With that, we, with all of those data, we end up developing several different models using first a generalized linear mixed model, which is just a traditional logistic regression model. And then we use a couple of machine learning methods, including the boosted regression trees and random forest we created these habitat suitability models with those 3 different methods. And then we combine them using an ensemble model. An ensemble habitat suitability model combines the outputs of the individual models. Each of them uses a different modeling algorithm, and so that increases the, essentially it averages out inherent model biases and tends to be a stronger modeling approach. And so that's what we end up using is our ensemble model. And here just highlights some of the performance metrics, which underscores that the ensemble model had a high performance, where the AUC was 0.96, the percent correctly classified was 0.87, the ability to correctly identify prairie dog habitat, we set at 95%. And the overall error rate was 13%. So our model had high predictive accuracy. And here is what it looks like. This is our habitat suitability model for the black-tailed prairie dog under current climate. When you're looking at the different colors, you see the darker the green is the more suitable habitat. The browner is the least suitable. And what you can see is Colorado represents, not surprisingly, the heart of the prairie dog range. Wyoming, southern Montana, northern New Mexico, parts of the panhandle are all important areas for prairie dog, important areas for providing good habitat for the prairie dog ecosystem. A lot of that brown area that you see, the light beige area, is lower suitability, especially in the eastern part of their range because of cropland development. And then in the southern portion of the range, there's been a real decline in their populations because of climate change. So the southern part of their range has been declining in suitability with increasingly arid climate. So this is what the current suitability looks like. And I'd like to acknowledge Michelle Fink, who's the landscape ecologist at the Colorado Natural Heritage Program, who did a lot of the heavy lifting with this ensemble habitat suitability model. If we were to zoom in, this is just a little visual of what it looks like. So
Anna, I'm sorry.
Corner.
Anna, sorry to interrupt. We are having some problem with the audio. It's not as clear. So perhaps if you turn off your video, it may become clear.
Let's try this. Thank you for letting me know.
I think it's more about the signal. It's
okay.
So it may work with the video of you were mostly coming okay, but just toward the end right now, I think I'm seeing some problem.
Okay, does this sound okay now?
Yes, let's try. Let's keep going.
Okay, I'll give it a try and just let me know. Okay, so when you're looking at the upper left-hand corner, you can see the habitat suitability model zoomed in, and that's Colorado there in the upper left. And when you look at the corner, or if you look at the slide on the right, you have each of them with prairie dog occurrences. Those orange dots are the prairie dog occurrences in the data set. And you can see they overlap with the green habitat, especially the dark green, very well. And then in the lower left, you can see that satellite imagery. And on the lower right, you can see the National Land Cover Database. There is representing you can see especially the yellow represents cropland. The green is showing grassland, and the blue is showing shrubland. So this is just to get a little visual of kind of what it looks like as we zoom in and how it relates to a reality on the ground and the land cover that is occurring. And you can see how the significant role of the cropland. Zooming in even further, and again, you can see the pixels and how they relate. So up in the upper left-hand corner, you can see it's kind of pixelated. And then to the right, you can see the associations of the prairie dog occurrences. And the lower left, the satellite imagery, and then again an LCD, which shows where the intact grassland versus cropland is, for example. And again, how all of that relates to the habitat suitability model. So when we project into the future, here's the current climate, and then we project into the future under a warm and wet scenario and a hot and dry scenario. In both cases, we see a northward movement of habitat suitability. This is not surprising because this is what we all know is going on for the vast majority of species in this region. But it does give us information on the probability of this certain areas becoming less suitable. So Colorado in the west, in the wet and warm scenario, Colorado is still a stronghold, but the Oklahoma Panhandle, parts of Texas and New Mexico decrease in suitability, and Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas become more important. And the hot and dry scenario is similar, except for Colorado declines in its suitability. And I'd like to acknowledge Imtiaz for helping to guide us in this future projection of the climate data. It was really integral to our efforts here. So thank you, Imtiaz, for your guidance. The next thing that we wanted to do was not only, like I mentioned, that was creating this ecological layer. Where should we be protecting prairie dogs, or where are they most likely to occur across this landscape? So that's what we just did. Now we want to not only assess the suitability of the habitat for the prairie dog ecosystem, but also the social and political landscape, threats such as development, habitat connectivity, and the general ecological landscape, such as the percent of grass cover. So this is the second part of our project that I'll be talking about now, which is really a conservation planning effort. It follows the same methodological approach that was used by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to develop a recovering plan for the northern spotted owl. And it involved using the conservation planning tool zonation to identify multiple scenarios of what kinds of habitats we might want to prioritize given various questions of interest. This modeling effort uses the zonation, which produces a hierarchical prioritization of the landscape based on the conservation value of each cell. Each cell has a habitat value, and zonation is aiming to increase to preserve cells that have high conservation value, and not only for the cell itself, but also based on surrounding cells. So it incorporates that connectivity as well. So this was our next effort, and I'm going to be presenting the general methods we chose, as well as some of our final results. But I do want to qualify this is that while the habitat suitability model, everything you just saw is final, the maps that you're about to see are not. We are in the process of finalizing this. So the first part of this part of the project of our conservation planning effort including a whole suite of landscape variables. And so I've I've highlighted some of them here. We're including landscape change, land use change, landscape fragmentation, private lands conservation, protected areas, the percent of grass cover, oil and gas activities, wind turbines, and road densities, the whole suite of landscape variables. And I want to acknowledge Mike Houts, who has been super awesome in helping to gather and synthesize some of this data for this process. The next part of the data that we were interested in incorporating in this conservation planning effort were the social variables. We have 3 social variables that we've decided to include. Those represent the social willingness of the community to embrace conservation, as well as the institutional capacity to actualize conservation. So the League of Conservation Voters scorecard reflects the social willingness to embrace conservation. So that's how you're probably familiar with these scorecards, but it reflects the different congressional districts and the support for environmental legislation. Northeast New Mexico, for example, is showing up as very strongly supportive of conservation. For example, Santa Fe, Taos occur in this area. And then we also included land and water conservation fund projects. So that just shows the number of these projects that are being funded. And so that helps to reflect an institutional capacity to actualize conservation. And then finally, my colleague, Matt Williamson, has really taken a novel approach to quantifying social perceptions and attitudes into a spatial framework. And part of a survey he did included questions related to the Blacktail prairie dog. He asked in his survey people what their ability or what their support was for questioning specifically, how would you like to see populations of prairie dogs change in the next 5 years? And the probability that people would say they would like them to increase somewhat or increase greatly is reflected in this survey. So, and then he was able to spatialize this data across the Black-tailed prairie dog range. So this was our social data. As part of this process, we have all of those layers that I just talked about, the landscape variables, the prairie dog habitat suitability, and the social layers. And then we create our model. And in this process, we have been working very closely with the land and wildlife managers and experts in the field to help guide our efforts, inform what the needs are, and to vet our results. So this has been a process where we've received feedback already from each of the states. The WAFWA, Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, the WAFWA Prairie Dog Conservation Team has been integral to guiding our efforts and providing us with reviews and feedback. So these are our results that I'm presenting now. They're very near final. They're not going to change much at all, but they are not absolutely final, the ultimate final maps. So please bear that in mind. So what you're seeing here is under present climate. These are the priority areas highlighted across the Black-tailed prairie dog range within the U.S. The redder, the color, the bright red is, I guess you can think of it, the bright red and the pinks are the most suitable, or they have the highest priority for conservation. So reds and pinks have the highest suitability for conservation. So for example, the bright red represents the top 2% of the landscape that has the highest, potential for conservation for the prairie dog ecosystem. The black and the blue represent the least has the lowest has the lowest priority. So we won't want to focus our efforts in the black and the blue areas, for example. And when we project this into the future under the hot and dry future scenario, you can see a slight shift northward in the priority areas. And then the warm and wet, same thing, a slight shift to the north, but pretty similar. You can see Arizona and New Mexico and Texas kind of fall out of these priority areas. We're interested in seeing how these priority areas and the projections overlap over time and space. And so what you're looking at here is the overlap of the top 25% of priority areas across all three scenarios. So the red represents the priority areas that are only priority during the current climate. The orange is for the future climate scenarios, and the green is where all climate scenarios, present and future, hot and dry and warm and wet, where all those scenarios overlap. So this might be, we think this is a good map for guiding conservation. If you were to ask yourself, where should we be focusing our conservation efforts across the range of prairie dogs? Where should we be buying land to protect the prairie dog ecosystem? Those green areas are probably the ones you want to focus on. This is just being able to look across the range and those the three different scenarios and the overlap, and just an opportunity for you to sort of eyeball the different patterns and distributions of priority areas and how they change. And unsurprisingly, as most of you know, grasslands are very underprotected and underappreciated. And so unsurprisingly, very little of the priority areas, or the potential priority area landscapes for the prairie dog ecosystem are not currently under protection. That's what these maps show. On the left shows the overlap of the top 25% and how it overlaps with protected areas. And you can see very little is currently protected. The red shows what is of those, the top 25% of across that overlapped, those overlap scenarios. The red is indicating what is not currently protected. And when we want to understand what is underlying some of these priority area results, we want to understand where threats are highest and how it might be influencing the priority area maps that I just showed you. Here shows the hotspots of threats. So the red shows the higher degree of threats. And I have in that little box there, you can see the various threats that are included in this map. So there's on the eastern, especially the southeastern part of the range, croplands and fragmentation and the overall landscape fragmentation and oil and gas are really high threats in that part of the range. This is a habitat fragmentation map that David Augustine and colleagues created. This was published in Rangeland Ecology a few years back, and David took this same effort and created it for the entire range of the Blacktail prairie dog. But what you can see here, which I find really interesting, is if you look at this map that he created here, an area in northeastern New Mexico, southeastern Colorado, and Wyoming are all coming out as having low fragmentation, high connectivity. And so this, and for those of us that are familiar with these landscapes, like Thunder Basin is up here, in southeastern Colorado, the Southern Plains Land Trust, northeastern New Mexico, these are all really intact grasslands. And so this kind of information is coming into play. Also, when you consider the black and the orange, those are areas that are highly fragmented. And in the hotspots of threats, you can see how that sort of overlaps with this red area. So next we have, we're trying to understand how the social information is playing a role in the priority areas modeling effort. And what we find is that the social landscape is not playing a very large role in informing the priority area selection. The threats and the habitat suitability are playing the largest role. So when you look to the left at the map, to the left here, you can see the priority areas distribution without social data included. And to the right is when social data is included. And there's not much of a change. The main change that you can see is in southeastern Arizona, where there's a lot of the land and water conservation projects being funded. And so that's really what's playing in here. So the next thing we're interested in is providing this information by state. As most of you know, a lot of conservation dollars are funneled through states and at that state level. So land managers are going to be interested in identifying, well, where should I put my conservation efforts in my state? That's what this is aiming to do here. On the left, you see the priority areas across the entire range. And to the right, you see the priority areas within each state. And so the results are very different because the question is different. If you're wanting to know where the priority areas are in the state of Colorado, then you might focus right here in southeastern Colorado. Or if you're interested in across the entire range, then you're going to have a different answer. And so these two different ways of looking at the questions of interest provide different model scenarios for different conservation needs. And we're doing this for the future projections as well. So we have across the entire range and then by state. And then again, under a warm and wet future scenario, we have across the entire range and then by state. And similar to that the overlap map that I showed you earlier, here you're looking at by state. So if you're interested in New Mexico, knowing that New Mexico is going to be decreasing in priority areas over time in terms of the climate change impact, you can still look where there's some overlap across the range within the state. So it gives a whole different perspective. And that is our goal, is to provide different model scenarios for different questions of interest and needs for on-the-ground management conservation. But again, the social data did not play a large role in influencing our outcome. Here is the present climate without social data, and then present climate with social data. And this is at the state level. And very, very little difference. I would like to acknowledge my friend and colleague, Fernanda, who is a postdoctoral researcher. She is an expert in zonation and has guided and informed how to conduct this conservation planning effort using the zonation modeling approach. And so we are all incredibly grateful to her knowledge and expertise and the help that she has provided in generating the model scenarios you see. And finally, I want to highlight that our project is not yet done, but it's nearing completion. We should have our results available by the summer, and we will be making them available on online portals, including the USGS Science Base, through Colorado State University, the Colorado Natural Heritage Program, and the Chat Crucial Habitat Assessment Tool. We'll also be providing our data to the Central Grasslands Roadmap so that it can be integrated into informing that overall effort, as well as creating an online web map. And the idea behind that web map is that you'll be able to zoom in and be able to explore these maps at high resolution without needing to have ArcGIS or any of those skills or capabilities to do. You'll just be able to explore the landscape and identify the priority areas and the various layers of that come into play in forming those priority areas. So that will also be available. And finally, I would like to acknowledge and thank all of my colleagues and funding sources and collaborations that have made this effort possible. There's been a massive amount of data and computing power with this project. And it's been really awesome to work with extremely talented colleagues in this effort. I do want to acknowledge the Kansas Wildlife Parks and Tourism that has been the funding source for this project, and Bill Van Pelt and WAFWA overall, who has made this project, has been critical to making this project happen as well through the funding side and making sure that we are working closely with the prairie dog conservation team and the wildlife and land managers. So it's been an awesome collaborative effort, and I'm really grateful to all the partners involved. And with that, I'll be very happy to address any questions you guys might have.
Great. Hey, Anna, thanks so much. That was great. Maybe you can leave your slides on. You might need it to answer some of the questions. So we have a very active chat box today and a lot of comments and some very interesting questions. I'll probably start with some questions first. So there's some interest in getting the BTPD social survey results. At least 3 people have submitted their email addresses. Is it possible to get that result data?
That data is, well, so some of it is, you can download the data, like the League of Conservation Voter Scorecard, for example. That data is just publicly available, and we downloaded that and put it into a spatial framework. But the survey data is Matt Williamson's data. And so he's provided that to this project. It's part of a much broader project that he has where he did a similar survey. This is just part of his survey where he asked people about whole suites of wildlife species across the West, and to try to assess people's attitudes and support towards their conservation. So I'm not aware of anything like what he's done, and I think it's really awesome what he has available, but I'm not able to share it. But if people are interested, they could contact Matt Williamson. He's at Boise State.
Great, thanks. Perhaps we could find his email and put it in the chat box.
Yeah, absolutely.
Moving on, there was a question about earlier on, and probably you covered it later on in your talk. How did you define protected areas? And maybe a related question with that is what lands or designations are you considering under protection?
Yeah, that's a very good question. those protected areas, we only consider the gap status 1 and 2. So in that case, we're talking about national parks, wildlife, wilderness areas. So highly protected areas, not just Forest Service or BLM, that use data set for that. And for those of you that are familiar with that data set, there's a lot of information in there, and it's pretty complex, and not all of it is updated in various ways. And so we wanted to focus on those areas that are very well defined as protected habitats. So it's gap 1 and 2 is what is represented in those maps.
The next question is, do the hotspots of threats include future threats? Again, I think referring to one of your figure there. For example, it is a landscape that's already row crop, or would that not be included as a hotspot of threat? I don't know if that last piece was clear. So
yeah.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
I think I understand it. You can think of it in 2 ways. One is some of it, so we have the habitat suitability is fundamentally in there, and in that's where we have the cropland is coming into play. So already established croplands. Other threats like its potential for tillage risk is, and that is one of the threat variables. Projected land use change is another variable that is a data set that is available online. And climate change comes into play not as a threat in that particular in that particular graph that you guys saw or map, but it is coming into play in our zonation effort where there's a interactive term that provides looking at connectivity as we look at current climate into future climate. So zonation is considering that connectivity over that temporal space. So that threat map does not specifically include climate specifically in that, but it is it's being considered in a different way in the zonation maps that you saw. The overall priority areas map does consider climate change as kind of a directional temporal movement.
So is future land use change included, and is that informed by climate?
The future land use change is a variable that's represented in that threats figure. And so these are the variables. It's land use change, and that's a projected land use change. So we were just looking at threats specifically in this, whereas zonation is the overall priority areas modeling is considering more than just this. Like I said, it's looking at climate change in the context of how it relates to future and projected climate through that interaction.
Right. Well, moving on. Again,
I'm happy to, if I can clarify that at all, I'd be happy to talk. I can do that more if anybody wants to clarify, like write in the chat how I can better answer that question to better address your interest. Just let me know.
Great. Okay. The next question is, what comprise your grass layer cover? Was it comprised of both native prairie grasslands and tame grasslands, or just native? How does this relate to your protected versus unprotected layers?
This is based on the land cover data is the National Land Cover Database. So that is where the grassland data, all the grass and shrub data come from. The USGS National Land Cover Database from 2016. And I think I have it somewhere where it shows, oh, here it is. And so here's the land cover, what it looks like across the Blacktail prairie dog range and the various categories that it includes. So grassland in that case would include the CRP grasses. So not all native per se, but it's going to consider grasslands of any kind.
And I'm just reminded this earlier question I asked, if we really covered it, like how did we define protected areas?
How would I define protected areas?
Right.
The way that we are defining it is based on the PAD US data, which is based on the GAP database, which is the US GAP status 1 and 2. So that has a definition, a specific definition for it. So let's see, where do I talk about GAP? If I can find it. Okay, I think where are we presented? Should be right here, I believe. Yeah, so it's the protected area database GAP status. So status 1 represents national parks, wilderness areas, and status 2 represents national wildlife refuges, state parks, and nature conservancy preserves. The same analysis could be done that includes status 3, for example, and that would be national forest, BLM lands, state forests, and state parks. We did not include that in this analysis, in what you see here. It's also equally relevant, for sure.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that.
Sure.
So we have the next question. Yeah, quite interesting. Yeah, it appears that a lot of connectivity is lost across top priority areas when scaling from regions to state. How does that influence management, and is that a problem for conservation?
I think I see it a little bit differently. Let's look at a state comparison. Okay, so here we're looking as an example at current priority areas across the prairie dog range and then by state. It's not about losing connectivity, it's just a different question. So if you are just wanting to identify, you're a conservation organization, you want to purchase some land, and you want to find, where should I focus our conservation dollars to purchase land that would protect the prairie dog ecosystem, for example. You might want to go to this area in Southeast Colorado and be like Southern Plains Land Trust and purchase some lands around here, because there's a lot of connectivity, and it is one of the highest conservation priorities across the entire prairie dog range. But if you were in New Mexico, you might want to know, where should you focus your conservation dollars, time, and energy within your state. You don't, in that sense, you may not care about what it looks like anywhere else but in your state. And so it's an entirely different question. So your answer is going to be very different. So within the state of New Mexico, relative to the state of New Mexico, you might want to pick this area in northeastern New Mexico for focusing your conservation efforts. So each state has its own set of priorities, and it's going to be separate and different from the range wide. Does that make sense? If that's unclear, please let me know. I'll be happy to talk about that a little more. And I know it's created some confusion for folks.
That was my question, Christina Leopold. I'll turn the video. Hi. I do spatial prioritization in for Hawaii, but I live in Colorado, so I'm very here to talk. And yeah, so I was curious because we work with land managers too. So if we're talking to a manager in the state of Colorado, you know, or over in Nebraska, you know, like all of a sudden there's areas showing up maybe in Nebraska that would be important, but it's not showing up at all on this
exactly
region-wide map. And so, you know, we're going to get the issue where people are asking, well, why should I have to do that with our limited state dollars when we know the most important areas are actually over in Colorado and New Mexico and Wyoming. And so, I mean, that's kind of, I mean, that's just what I noticed because we have to deal with scale. I was really curious about the zonation process generally, but I can follow up with that another time. But yeah, I was curious about that because there's a lot of managers, you're going to give them very different answers, and that gets kind of confusing when you're working with state dollars or federal dollars. So I was wondering if you had any insights from, like, if you had feedback from managers already about presenting this, you know, two different types of information.
Yeah, I think there's been a little bit of confusion. Like, it's like, well, why does this look different? But once they have understood that it's really a different question. So it depends what your interest is. And when they think, oh, okay, this is saying what's relevant to me in my state. I have conservation dollars for prairie dogs. They're part of our swap. They're written as a, you know, a priority species for our state, and we have money and resources to focus our efforts on them. If we're going to do it in our state, it's going to be in these areas, or this is at least what this map guides us to do. But if you have federal dollars and you're just a conservation organization that has no specific state boundary of concern, then you might look more broadly. So it just depends on the conservation interest. And I just don't, I definitely, you know, our goal ultimately is to protect areas across the range. We don't want to only protect areas within, you know, the heart of the range. We want to be able to have a wide distribution of habitats that we protect. And so I do think it's relevant to focus within states and then more broadly. I think it just addresses two different questions. And I'm not sure if that is going to speak well to everybody, but it's just two different ways of looking at it.
Yeah, great discussion. Just moving on to just cover a few more questions before I open up to the floor. The next by Rich Redding. It is curious to me that the social science data has little influence on your results. Could this be a result of weight you placed on these data?
We played around with lots of weighting. We have really increased the social value in terms of the weightings in this conservation planning effort, and it doesn't change anything. It has more to do with the data itself. Let me go to where it is. I will say that we've been, I think so many of us are really interested in this social data. And this is really important to incorporate. And it surprises all of us that it doesn't play a larger role. So what we're choosing to do and in the process of doing is trying to display the data in a way in which land managers and people interested can, like through that web map, they can just zoom into the individual layers of social information so that they can explore relevant to their questions. So it might not be really strongly showing up in the priority areas map, the collective map, but you can look more specifically based on the different layers. So I don't have all of the data in the different ways that we're working on presenting it, but we are trying to synthesize the data in some other ways that will help folks be able to consider these social variables just probably from a separate perspective. The reason, like if you look at this data, if we look at the survey data here on the right, these are the probability. So the colors are representing that. So the darker the red, the higher the probability somebody is favorable of prairie dogs increasing in their area. But if you look at the variability or the variation here, there's not a whole lot. The probability ranges from 0.22 to 22% to 0.33, so 33%. So there's not a large range. Overall, there's a low support. So I think that is part of what's driving this. If our range was between like maybe 20% and 90%, I think we'd see some different results.
And there's a question from Maurice Belgard about, we are getting like Canada where there are little sections of prairie dog protected parks. Is it too much farming, plague?
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, yeah, and Maurice, feel free to jump in. But I think the thought is why the protected areas are so fragmented, and is it we're getting more like Canada with too much farming and plague?
Well, I mean, if you think about the grassland landscape, like the central grasslands in general, it's a domesticated landscape now. It's entirely fenced, and so much of it has been tilled and is cropland now. And it's not only the ecological changes, the specific changes to the land, but also the jurisdictional boundaries, the land ownership. So it's fragmented across multiple scales. And that creates incredible challenges for protecting and conserving and maintaining intact grassland ecosystems, connectivity among them, and especially with like migratory movement of larger mammals, for example. And we see the same kinds of issues with birds. That's why the grassland birds are the most endangered among all the birds in North America, other groups. Grasslands are highly unprotected, and there are this social, cultural, jurisdictional fragmentation across that landscape and ecological are really creating huge challenges. And so that Grasslands Roadmap effort, the Central Grasslands Roadmap effort, for those of you that aren't familiar, I'd encourage you just to Google it. It is a comprehensive effort among those interested in trying to augment the protection and conservation of grasslands, of the central grasslands. And it's a roadmap towards that goal. So there's much, it really comes down to a lot of these areas just have not been prioritized. And we don't think of grasslands as we think of maybe the redwood forest or mountains. And it's about, I think we need to be starting to influence the thinking of our grasslands were once like this, the Serengeti, and that they are incredibly important, and they once harbored incredible diversity and abundance of wildlife. And it's important to try to figure out how to protect and preserve and maintain what we have in these grasslands, because they're highly fragmented indeed.
Yeah. And we just have time for one more question. I'll pass it to Dennis Longknife. Dennis, go ahead and unmute yourself. Dennis, we can't hear you. Yeah. Okay.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is more of a, I don't know if it's more of a comment than a question, but as a young boy growing up near a prairie dog community for the past, let's say 40, 50 years, we used to actively kill bull snakes that we would see around these prairie dog communities. And it was until an elder told us that not to do that anymore, and because they provide a service. And we noticed their main diets after opening up a few bull snakes, they'd be full of prairie mice and all kinds of other mice species, I guess you'd call it. But yeah, and they help keep the prairie dog communities clean of mice. So you'd think that they'd be predators for the prairie dogs, but actually they kind of work in unison with the prairie dogs. And I guess I'm not sure. I never seen any studies, but I was just wondering if the bull snakes bother the prairie dogs, because it seems like they're providing a service by helping keeping their communities clean of mice, and also they scare off the rattlesnakes that would probably go after prairie dogs too. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
and I'm speechless.
Yeah, no, I was just wanting to make sure you were done. Yeah, the bull snakes, I'm not sure how much that they are significant predators of prairie dogs. Certainly the rattlesnakes are. They all tend to utilize the prairie dog burrows a lot for homes and shelter. So yeah, they're not, snakes in general are not major predators of prairie dogs, but I've definitely seen a number of rattlesnake impacts on prairie dogs.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your comments, Dennis. Very interesting. I think we are past our time, and I just want to thank everyone for joining and asking these excellent questions. And I'll share all your comments with Anna that came through the chat. And at this point, I just want to thank Anna for presenting to us today. Just this great work. And if folks feel like they can go to your reaction thing and give her an applause. So thank you, Anna, very much, and good luck with the rest of your future work.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for joining. I really appreciate this opportunity to share what we've been working on, and I am eager to share these maps and results with you guys this summer.